We booked the cabin 3 weeks before the trip, and the photos looked exactly like what we wanted. A little log place off a Forest Service road in Shoshone, maybe 20 minutes east of Dubois, Wyoming. No cell signal on the property. One bar if you walked up the driveway. That part didn't bother us in June of 2019. That was kind of the point. Nora had just finished her second year of grad school, and I was between jobs. We wanted quiet, we got quiet. The host was a guy called Randy in the profile. Superhost badge, 40-something reviews, all 5 stars going back to 2016. Check-in was self-serve through a lockbox on the porch railing. He sent one message the day before we drove up. Welcome. Wood is stacked under the tarp. If you need anything, text this number. That was it. The cabin sat in a clearing maybe 100 yards off the gravel road, with pines packed in tight on 3 sides and a small creek running behind it. One neighbor. You couldn't see the house from the porch, but you could see the roof line through the trees if you walked toward the creek. Green metal roof, propane tank in the yard. We noticed a truck parked out front the first afternoon and figured whoever lived there was around. Nora waved at him when we passed on our first hike. He was standing at the tree line with a chainsaw in his hand, not cutting anything, just holding it. Tall, maybe 60, gray beard, red jacket, faded pink at the shoulders. He nodded back, didn't smile. That was fine. Not everyone smiles. The first night was easy. We made pasta on the propane stove, drank the wine we'd brought from the grocery in Riverton, played gin rummy at the little pine table by the window. I remember Nora saying the cabin smelled like wood smoke and clean laundry, which was true. Whoever cleaned it did a real job. The second morning is when it started. I got up first, around 7, and went to make coffee. The mug Nora had used the night before, a big blue one with a chipped handle, wasn't on the drying rack where she'd left it. I found it on the top shelf of the cabinet above the sink next to the other mugs. I didn't think about it much, figured maybe I'd put it away half asleep the night before and forgotten. When Nora came out, I asked her, kind of joking, if she'd been sleepwalking. She looked at me weird and said no, she hadn't touched it. We both laughed it off. That was that. We went out around 10 for a longer hike. Popo Aggie Loop, some of it. Got back around 3 in the afternoon, muddy boots, both of us hungry. I bent down to pull my boots off on the porch, and I noticed the doormat. It was one of those cheap choir mats that says welcome on it. When we'd left that morning, it said welcome facing the door, the way it's supposed to. When we got back, it was flipped around. The word was facing out toward the driveway, backwards. I stared at it for a second, then I picked it up and turned it around and told Nora, "Hey, did you flip the mat this morning?" She said no. She said she hadn't touched it either. Inside, everything looked normal at first. Then Nora noticed her hairbrush was on the nightstand instead of the bathroom counter, where she was sure she'd left it. My book had been moved from the arm of the couch to the coffee table, closed, no bookmark, when I'd left it open and face down. Small things, nothing missing, nothing broken, just moved. We stood in the middle of the main room and just looked at each other. Nora said maybe the host had come by, maybe there was a cleaning schedule we didn't know about. That felt like a stretch, but it was better than the alternative, so we went with it. I texted Randy, "Hey, just wondering if anyone came by the cabin today. Some stuff got moved around, want to make sure everything's okay." The message went through, no reply. We ate dinner quiet. We locked the door, which we hadn't been doing the first night. Both of us went to bed early, and I lay awake for a long time listening. The cabin made the sounds cabins make. Wood settling, something small on the roof, probably a pine cone. Around midnight, I heard a diesel engine start up somewhere down the road and then fade off. That was it. I texted Randy again in the morning. Nothing. His last activity on the Airbnb app was 2 days before we checked in. Nora wanted to leave. I said, "Let's just do one more day. We already paid, we're already here." Honestly, I felt stupid for being spooked by a coffee mug. We compromised. We'd do a short hike, come back, pack up if anything still felt wrong. The short hike is where I made the mistake that changed my mind. We took the trail behind the cabin toward the creek, and I doubled back after about 10 minutes because I'd forgotten the water bottle. Nora waited on the path. I came up on the cabin from the tree line instead of the driveway, and when I stepped into the clearing, the neighbor was on our porch. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, on the top step, looking at the door. Red jacket, same as before, no chainsaw this time. His hands were empty and hanging at his sides. He didn't hear me because of the creek. I said, "Hey, can I help you?" He turned around slow. Not startled, just turned around the way you turn around when someone says your name in a store. He looked at me for a second and then he said, "Thought I heard a raccoon under the porch, wanted to check." He walked down the steps, past me, close enough that I could smell him. Cigarettes and gasoline. He said, "You folks have a good day," and walked back into the trees toward his place. I stood there for a minute. Then I got down on my hands and knees at the corner of the porch and looked under. The porch was maybe 1.5 feet off the ground. Dirt underneath, some old leaves, spider webs. And about 4 feet in, a plastic grocery bag wrapped around something rectangular, held together with a rubber band. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a notebook. One of those green composition books, the kind you buy for $1 at a drugstore, wrapped tight in plastic to keep the moisture off. I opened it on the porch. I couldn't wait. The first entry was dated July of 2016. It said something like, "Couple from Denver, Rob and Melissa. He is heavyset, glasses, beard. She is thin, dark hair to shoulders, tattoo of a bird on the back of her neck. Arrived Friday evening. They keep the blinds open in the bedroom." That was the first entry. There were dozens after it. Every guest, every stay. Descriptions of what people looked like, what time they left in the morning, what time they came back, whether they locked the door, whether they closed the blinds. Some entries were short, some ran 2 pages. One of them, from October 2017, just said the woman had cried on the porch for a long time on the second night and that the man had not come out. Another from that summer noted that a guest had gone swimming in the creek alone at dusk. It listed what she wore. It listed how long she was in the water. I flipped to the back. The last entry was 2 pages long. It described me. Height about right, hair color, the flannel I'd worn on the drive up. It described Nora, her hair, her build, the small silver hoop she wore in her left ear, the fact that she was left-handed, which he could only have known if he'd watched her eat. It listed the times we left the cabin the day before, to the minute. It listed the make of our rental car. It said, "We locked the door on the second night but not the first." It said Nora slept on the side of the bed near the window. It was dated the previous day. I closed the notebook. I walked back down the trail to get Nora. I didn't tell her what it was until we were in the car with the doors locked. We packed in maybe 15 minutes. I kept the notebook on my lap in the passenger seat while she drove. Neither of us wanted to be the one facing the trees. Nora didn't say a word for the first hour on the road. Neither did I. We didn't see him on the way out. His truck wasn't at the house. I checked the Airbnb app when we hit signal outside Lander. Randy's profile was gone. Not deactivated, with a note, not marked unavailable. Gone, like the account had never existed. My booking was still in my history, but the host field was blank. We drove back to Salt Lake that night, 10 hours straight, taking turns. I called the sheriff's office in Fremont County the next morning from the hotel. They were polite. They took a report. A deputy called me back a week later and asked me to overnight the notebook to them, which I did after making copies of every page. They told me the cabin was owned by an LLC out of Nevada that nobody was picking up the phone at. They told me the neighbor's property was under a trust with no listed address. They told me they'd sent someone out to knock on the door and nobody answered, and the truck I described wasn't there. 3 months later, I got a letter saying the case had been closed pending new information. No suspect identified. The notebook was mailed back to me in a padded envelope, tucked between 2 sheets of cardboard, like it was a photograph somebody didn't want bent. It's in a drawer in my kitchen. I have not opened it since. The Cessna was nose down in a hayfield about 4 miles east of Ronan, tail sticking up at maybe 15 degrees, and by the time I got there, the pilot was already drinking coffee out of a deputy's thermos. August 2022, middle of the afternoon. The kind of Montana heat where the pavement smells and the grasshoppers are loud enough that you notice them over your own voice. I was based out of the small regional field near Kalispell then, contracted through the NTSB for the smaller stuff. Light aircraft, forced landings, the incidents that don't make the news past the local paper. Most of my calls that summer were fuel exhaustion or students misjudging density altitude. This one came in as an engine failure with a soft landing and no injuries. On the drive out, I was thinking, this'll be a 2-page write-up, home by dinner. The pilot's name was Owen. Late 40s, wiry, sunburned neck, wearing a faded blue polo with a flight school logo on it. He owned the plane, flew it 2 or 3 times a week, had about 1,100 hours logged. He shook my hand and said, "It just quit." I was at cruise, everything was normal, and then it just quit. I asked him if he'd noticed any roughness before the failure. He shook his head. Smooth, then nothing. I trimmed for glide, picked the field, called it in. That was it. He said it the way people say things when they've already said them 4 times that day. Deputies, medics, his wife on the phone. He wasn't rattled. A little tired, maybe. The plane looked okay. Prop was bent from the touchdown, 1 wingtip scuffed. No fire, no fuel leak. I walked around it twice, took photos, checked the fuel selector, the mixture, the mags. All where you'd expect them to be after a forced landing. He'd even remembered to shut off the master before climbing out. I made a note of that. Most pilots don't when they're that scared. We loaded the recorder into the back of my truck that evening. It wasn't a full flight data recorder, nothing like what you'd get on an airliner. Just the engine monitor and the avionics logger the school had put in as an upgrade a few years back. But it logged enough: RPM, EGT, fuel flow, manifold pressure, bus voltage, and time-stamped every switch throw on the panel down to the 10th of a second. I got back to the office around 9, cracked a window because the air conditioning had been off all day and the room smelled like old coffee, plugged the reader in, made the pull, opened the file. At first, everything looked normal. Takeoff from Polson, climb to 7500, cruise. Fuel flow steady, everything green. He'd been up about 40 minutes when the sequence started. 14:32 and 11 seconds. Auxiliary fuel pump, off. That's fine. You don't need it at cruise. 14:32 and 19 seconds. Landing light, off. Also fine. It wasn't on, except that it was off, and then the log shows it going off again. Like someone reached down and flipped a switch that was already down. I sat back in my chair. 14:32 and 26 seconds. Avionics master, off. That kills the radios and the transponder. Explains why ATC lost him for about a minute before he came back on the handheld. 14:32 and 31 seconds. Alternator, off. 14:32 and 38 seconds. Magnetos, both to off. 14:32 and 40 seconds. Mixture, idle cutoff. 14:32 and 44 seconds. Fuel selector, off. The engine wound down over the next few seconds. Fuel flow to 0. EGT dropping, prop windmilling. Then, 11 seconds later, everything except the ignition came back on. Master backup, avionics backup, fuel selector to both. Someone had put the airplane back in a proper glide configuration and turned the radio on to call for help. I watched the file play through twice more before I got up to make coffee. The order is what I couldn't get past. If you're going to shut down a light single in flight, that is exactly how you do it. Aux pump, then avionics, then alternator, then mags, then mixture, then fuel. You do it in that order, so nothing arcs, nothing pops, nothing surprises you. It's the shutdown flow. 12 seconds. Textbook. You do not do that by accident. You do not do that with a hand on your knee that slipped. I called Owen the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I'd pulled the recorder and wanted to walk through the last minute of the flight with him. He said, "Sure, what did it show?" I asked him, in as flat a voice as I could manage, whether he had shut down the engine himself. There was a pause, then he said, "No." Why would I do that? I told him what the log showed, every switch, in order, in 12 seconds. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "I don't remember doing that." Not, "I didn't do that." I don't remember doing that. I asked him if there was any chance someone else was on board. He laughed once, tight and short, and said, "It's a two-seater and I was in the left seat. Trust me." I got the sheriff's report. Deputies had been on scene within 20 minutes of the landing. Nobody walking away from the field, no second set of footprints in the flattened hay, no reports of anyone hitching a ride out on the county road. The right side door was still latched from the inside when the first deputy got there. He'd photographed it before Owen climbed out. The FAA sent Owen for a psychiatric evaluation, standard procedure when a pilot reports memory loss around an incident. The psychiatrist was a woman out of Missoula who did this work for the agency regularly. She spent 2 sessions with him. The write-up came back clean, no diagnosable condition. She suggested a dissociative episode brought on by acute stress, consistent with a fugue-like state, and in her opinion, he'd performed the shutdown himself without conscious awareness. The airplane was landed safely, she pointed out. The motor skills were preserved. The event was contained. That explanation got accepted. It closed the file at the regional level. Owen was suspended pending review, which everyone understood to mean grounded for good. I should have let it go there. I had a stack of other work. Instead, I went back to his records. Not the flight records, the medical ones the FAA had on file. And then, because something in the psych report bothered me, and I couldn't say what, I pulled every incident report the school and the local field had filed on him or with him in it, going back 5 years. There was one. 14 months earlier, July of the previous summer, Owen had been in the right seat that time. Instructor on a commercial check ride prep with a student working toward his rating. They were east of Great Falls when the student reported an engine failure. He put it down on a stretch of straight road. Different aircraft, different weather. No damage, no injuries. The write-up called it a fuel starvation event because when the mechanic looked at it, the selector was between tanks. Case closed in about a week. I read the student's statement twice. He said the engine had run rough for about a second, and then the airplane went quiet. He said Owen had been calm the whole time, that Owen had talked him through the emergency, that Owen's hands had been in his lap the entire descent. He was very clear about that last part, and I couldn't figure out why he'd bothered to mention it until I read the last paragraph. The student said that when they were on final for the road, Owen had told him in a normal conversational voice, "You're doing fine, it's not the plane." And then Owen had looked out the side window for the rest of the landing. The student passed the check ride 2 months later at a different school. Owen never signed off on it. I sat with that report for a long time. There is a version of this where a man had 2 dissociative episodes in a flying career, both under stress, both with harmless outcomes, and one of them happens to have a strange sentence in the paperwork. There is a version where a student misremembered a comment and wrote it down wrong. There is a version where I am reading a pattern into a coincidence because it is 1 in the morning and I have been staring at PDFs for 6 hours. I put the second report back in the folder. In my official write-up on the Ronin landing, I stated what the recorder showed, the sequence, the timing, the fact that no one else was on board and no one else could have been. I quoted the psychiatric evaluation. I recommended the suspension of Owen's medical certificate. I did not include the older incident. It wasn't mine to include. The airplane in July had landed on a road with a student on the yoke, and my job was to write the report on the Ronin flight, not to hunt for shapes in the fog. I signed it and sent it up the chain. Owen called me once after that, in the spring. He wanted to know if there was anything he could do to get his certificate back. He sounded the same as he had on the phone in August. Tired, polite, not angry. I told him the truth, that the decision wasn't mine, and I didn't think there was. He said, "I understand. I appreciate you being straight." Then, before he hung up, he said, "For what it's worth, I didn't turn the engine off." I said I knew that was what he remembered. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "That's not what I said." The line clicked off before I could answer. I stayed in that job another year. I flew a little, on my own certificate, out of the small field near Kalispell. I never had anything close to an incident. But the engine shutdown flow in a light single is a habit you build early and never lose. You could do it in your sleep. Some people apparently do. The paperwork on Marco's flight was clean. Too clean, in a way I couldn't put my finger on until I was already 3 questions deep, and he was still smiling. I worked nights at a regional field east of Albuquerque, the kind of place with 2 runways and 1 customs booth and a coffee machine that hadn't been serviced since I started, March of 2021. Most of the country was still half locked down, but private aviation didn't care about any of that. If anything, business was up. People with money didn't want to sit next to strangers on a Delta flight, so they burned 20 grand and had their own guy fly them from Cabo or Guadalajara straight into our field. We were the port of entry. It was on me to clear them. The terminal at that hour was empty, except for the janitor and the hum of the vending machine. Wind off the mesa made the hangar doors groan every so often, and if you were the only person awake in the building, you learned to time your bathroom breaks around the arrivals board. On a slow night, I'd clear 1, maybe 2 aircraft between midnight and dawn, sometimes 0. Sometimes I'd read half a paperback. Marco came in around 1:40 in the morning. Gulfstream, older model, tail number registered out of a leasing company in Texas. He was maybe 40, dark polo, neat hair, tired but polite in the way pilots are polite. He handed me his general declaration, his APIS printout, his crew list of 1, passengers, none, cargo, personal effects. Origin, Hermosillo, destination, our field. I flipped through the pages under the desk lamp. Everything matched. Stamp, sign, out the door. That should have been it. I asked him what time he lifted off. Standard question. I ask everybody. Most guys just say a time. Marco said, "Around 8:30 local." I nodded and glanced down at the flight plan he'd handed me. His nav log had wheels up at 4:15 local. Not close, not a rounding error. About 4 hours apart. I didn't say anything about it yet. I just kept flipping pages. The way you do when you're trying to give yourself 30 seconds to think. There's a rhythm to this job. Guys lie about small stuff all the time. They forget a bottle of tequila in the galley. They forget they're carrying a friend's laptop. They say they left at 9 when they left at 9:30. It's not always sinister. Pilots pull long duty days. They mix flights up in their head, especially if they've flown 2 legs. So I did the polite thing. I gave him the exit. "Long day?" I asked. "Long week," he said. "You come straight out of Hermosillo, or you sat down somewhere first?" "Straight through," he said. Small pause, not a big one, but it was there. There was some weather south of Chihuahua, had to swing wide. Might be why the times look funny. I hadn't told him the times looked funny. Now, that on its own isn't much. A pilot who's flown that leg 100 times knows his own paperwork. He might have already noticed I was staring at the nav log, but I filed it. That's the job. You file things. I asked him if I could see the aircraft. Not the interior, not yet. Just walk him back out to it. Take a look at the exterior. Standard ramp check. He said sure. He seemed genuinely fine with it. That's the thing that stuck with me later. He wasn't nervous, he was just tired. We walked out onto the ramp. Cold desert night, that sharp Albuquerque cold that gets in your ears. The Gulf Stream was parked nose out under the flood lamps, and I could see a thin line of oil weeping down the side of the left nacelle. Nothing dangerous, just old airplane stuff. The whole ramp smelled like jet fuel and cold asphalt. Marco started talking about the airframe, how many hours it had, how the leasing company kept promising to swap it for a newer bird. Friendly, normal. I asked him, casual as I could, if he'd mind me looking at the tail compartment. He said, sure, might take a second. Latch sticks. He walked around and popped it himself. Inside were 2 soft duffels and a hard-sided case, matte black, the kind you'd see for camera gear or a rifle. All of it fit the declaration if you squinted. Personal effects. But behind the duffels, pushed up against the pressure bulkhead, was a second hard case. Bigger, industrial. Not the kind of thing anyone would call personal. I asked what it was. Marco said, tools. Owner's a hobbyist. Machinist. He asked me to bring a few things back for a friend of his. Declared? Should be. He filled out the forms. I looked back at the paperwork on my clipboard. Nothing on there matched a case that size. No tools, no equipment, no commercial goods. I didn't push. I just closed the compartment gently and said, let's go back inside. I want to run a couple more numbers and then I'll get you on your way. That was the sentence I'd practiced 100 times. The one they teach you in training. You don't accuse. You don't tip your hand. You just create a reason to keep them close while you decide. Back in the booth, I told Marco to grab a seat. I offered him coffee. He took it, black. His hands didn't shake. He scrolled his phone, thumb going up and up, some kind of news app. He looked, honestly, bored. The fluorescent light above the counter did its little tick that it always did, and I could hear my own pulse in my ears, louder than I liked. I stepped into the back office and made 2 calls. First to my supervisor, second to the on-call team. In our region, there's a rotating group of officers who come out for secondaries, and the number rings a cell phone at whatever motel one of them happens to be at. I told the guy who answered what I had, keeping my voice low even though there was a door between me and Marco, the gap in the times, the extra case, the line about tools. He said, don't touch the aircraft again, don't let him move it, don't tell him anything specific. 50 minutes out. 50 minutes is a long time to sit across from a man you've decided is probably lying. I went back out. I told Marco we were doing a random secondary. Told him it was luck of the draw, computer picked him, sorry about the hour, should be quick. He said, no worries man, happens. He asked if there was a vending machine. We talked about nothing for a while. He told me about his kid. Little girl, 6 years old, lived with her mom in Phoenix. He said flying at night was the only way to see her during the week because he could deadhead back before school started. He asked about my kids. I told him I didn't have any yet. My wife and I were still trying. He said good luck with that in a way that sounded like he meant it. I remember thinking, if this guy is dirty, he's very good at this, or he's telling me something true anyway. Both can be real at the same time. The secondary team pulled up in 2 SUVs, no lights, 3 officers plus a supervisor. They were polite with Marco. Cuffed him only after they'd opened the industrial case on the ramp under the flood lamps and stood there for a minute looking at what was inside. I wasn't allowed close during the search itself, but I heard the supervisor on the phone later. Not narcotics. Not what you'd guess out of a Mexico run. It was hardware. Machined parts, packed in foam, no export paperwork, the kind of items that fall under a control list I'd only seen in training slides. Dual use, they called it. The kind of thing Treasury cares about more than DEA. While they worked, I went and pulled the radar track. Any officer can request it, but I'd never had a reason to before. The tech on the other end read it back to me line by line, tail number, altitude, heading, timestamp. Marco's aircraft had left Hermosillo, sure, but between Hermosillo and our field, there was a 42-minute window where the transponder went dark over open country. When it came back on, the altitude profile said he'd been on the ground somewhere. A strip, a road, something. Not a tower. Not filed anywhere. That was what got him, not the case. The 42 minutes. By 4 in the morning, Marco was sitting in the back of an SUV, not cuffed anymore, just sitting, looking at the dashboard. He caught my eye through the window once. He didn't glare. He didn't do anything you'd put in a movie. He just gave me a small nod, like, yeah, fair play. Then he looked back down at his hands. The SUV pulled out. I watched the taillights get small along the perimeter road until they hit the highway and turned east. The case eventually went to Treasury. I gave a statement that morning, and another one 2 weeks later, to a woman who flew in from DC and asked the same questions 6 different ways. I never found out where the 42 minutes on the ground had been, or who was waiting there, or where those parts were supposed to end up. I'm not sure anyone told me on purpose. I got a letter of commendation about 3 months later. It's in a drawer somewhere. My wife framed the envelope, not the letter, because the letter is boring and the envelope has the seal. The thing I think about isn't the case, it's how close I came to stamping him through. If he'd said 4:15 when I asked about the wheels up, I'd have signed his paperwork and gone back to my crossword. He was tired, and he mixed up his own lie by a couple of hours, and that was the whole margin. I still work nights. I still ask everybody what time they lifted off. Most of them just say a time.